Hi everyone, now we're going to go into the text of Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, and we're going to take a look at just the first two paragraphs to sketch the first position of immediate consciousness, or what Hegel calls die sinnliche Gewissheit. So on the right we have the English translation, and on the left the German text. I already made some contributions to a possible application of the text. I'm trying to read die sinnliche Gewissheit not so much as a form of sensuous knowledge, which it also is, at least that is the basic pattern of this consciousness, but I'm trying to apply it to what I call postmodern impatient consciousness. So you have to read the blog post on impatient consciousness to figure out what I mean by that. But the idea is that postmodern consciousness is characterized by, in itself, a proper idea. That is that all knowledge exists, all truth exists in the form of the immediate opinion, the immediate knowledge of what the world is, what I am, whatever the object is in the world. However, because of its impatience, it simply takes its own opinion for the truth. And in order to maintain that position, it has to grant to all other opinions the same status. So it has to say, this is my truth, this is my opinion, you can't change that, I have a right to this opinion, but I have to grant you the same right, right to have an opinion and to affirm that that is your particular truth. So let's take a look now at Hegel's analysis of immediate consciousness to see what this first position is more in detail. There are specific categories at work that Hegel uses to describe this form of immediate consciousness. It's very interesting to see how he works that out. So, without further ado, let's go to the text of Hegel with the translation. So there it is. To the left we have the title. I don't have that here in the translation. Die sinnliche Gewissheit, so sensuous certainty, oder das Diese und das Meinen. So, sensuous certainty is a form of consciousness, a form of knowledge. A form of knowledge always implies a specific relationship between the subject that knows, the knower, and the object that is known. And the object is characterized here by diese, this, simply this, as if you can simply point to something and declare that to be the object of your understanding, of your knowledge. Und das Meinen. Das Meinen is the word that Hegel uses for the relationship between the knowing subject and the knowing object. Note already here that das Diese, as a category, doesn't really distinguish between subject and object. In the same manner that the object is like a given, something that I can point to, precisely in that relationship, I, as a subject, am characterizing myself as just this over here. So it's this here, me, over against that there, and both are comprised in the idea of diese. Now, if you have this immediate ego, this immediate consciousness, in front of this immediate object of that same consciousness, that is simply a relationship of me toward the object. That is to say, I have an opinion. I have a Meinung in German, which contains the word mein, which is almost the same in English. Mein, M-I-N-E, is the same as the German mein, M-E-I-N. It means exactly belonging to me. So meinen is the relationship between a this here, pointing toward myself, and that over there. I see this. I have an opinion about that. I am conscious of something. That seems to be the most rich, it seems to be the richest kind of knowledge, because there's no movement within the subject, no thinking which is prone to error. There is no problem with the object, because I'm not saying anything about the object, I'm not making propositions about the object, I'm simply grabbing it or pointing toward it. The phenomenology of mind has to start with this kind of consciousness, and Hegel explains why. Das Wissen, welches zuerst oder unmittelbar unser Gegenstand ist. So we, as a philosophical consciousness, are now going to talk about forms of consciousness. Kann kein anderes sein als dasjenige, welches selbst unmittelbares Wissen, Wissen des Unmittelbaren oder Seienden ist. So, in a philosophical analysis, that kind of consciousness that is immediately the object of our analysis has to be the same kind of consciousness that I'm actually applying. There is a difference. Philosophical consciousness, of course, is reflexive. It takes note of its own movement. It examines its own categories and ideas. However, the consciousness that is the object of philosophical consciousness is the same. It's also an immediate awareness or immediate consciousness. However, it's not reflective. It's not analyzing itself. It has no relationship to itself, because that relationship to itself for that consciousness is also a meinen. Remember that I said in this relationship and this consciousness, consciousness is referring to the subject of knowledge merely as a this. So it uses the same category that is used to point to the object to point to itself. That's not reflexive. That is actually the opposite of reflection. It's simply pointing to the object or to myself, and in that movement between pointing toward the object, pointing toward myself, in that movement, that consciousness exists. Now I'm going to take a look at that. I'm going to step outside of it, but still I'm just pointing at that consciousness. I'm pointing at the consciousness in a way, reflecting on it and analyzing it certainly, but I don't have a whole series of ideas about what consciousness should be or can be or might be. I'm going to relate to that consciousness in the same manner that that consciousness relates to its object and to itself. However, I'm doing that in a reflective way. I'm making not an object to be my object, I'm making the consciousness of the object to be my object, and that's a reflexive element of it. In a way, I'm reflecting on myself as an immediate consciousness, and that changes everything. However, that change, which is quite vital to the whole of the phenomenology, that change has to be worked out, it has to develop. So we have philosophical consciousness in an immediate manner, taking an immediate object, and that immediate object is in the way itself, in the way it has presented itself within history. Or, in other words, it's actually the reflective mode of die sinnliche Gewissheit, of the sensuous certainty itself. It's sensuous inasmuch as it is not reflective. It is about das Diese und das Meinen in as far as it is reflective, because it's using categories to describe itself, which represents the reflective stage. But it's one and the same consciousness. The philosophical character of that consciousness is merely its reflectiveness, but is not something that we add to it. We don't have a whole series of propositions and presuppositions that we can apply here in the analysis. So that is why we have first the statement that we need to take a look at this kind of consciousness at first. Kan kein anderes sein als dasjenige welches selbst unmittelbares Wissen, Wissen des Unmittelbaren, so knowledge of what is immediately given. Unmittelbar means without categorization, without any further thought. It has to be simply a given. Oder Seienden ist. So in the language of this reflective mode, we can talk about something that simply is, without qualifying what it means to be ein Seiendes, something that is. So secondly, from this idea that one and the same consciousness has a direct sensuous mode and a reflective mode, and the reflective mode springs up from the fact that I'm going to think about myself as that consciousness, then we have the second sentence here. Wir, that is the reflective mode of that consciousness. That can say wir. We are already entering into a dialogue. We're using language to describe a consciousness that is, let's say, inevitable. We're not going to deduce all sorts of consequences from that. But we can't do anything other than this. This is not a presupposition that Hegel makes. It's simply the necessity, the demonstrated necessity of all kinds, of all sorts of philosophy. If you do philosophy, you enter into the world of a dialogue. You are having an object, which is consciousness in this case, that you have to think about. There is reflective analysis going on, and that's in the shape of a dialogue. Now, what is the form of this reflectiveness? Wir haben uns ebenso unmittelbar oder aufnehmend zu verhalten. So, aufnehmend, to be receptive. Here in the English translation, to accept what is given. We have to have a pure auffassen, a mere apprehension, and without the attempt to have a conceptual comprehension. So, also nichts an ihm wird sich dabei zu verändern. So we're not going to determine what kind of consciousness it is. We're not going to change it in that sense. We're not going to give a new name or another thing on it, another name to it. So we're not going to do, Hegel is saying, what I did by applying this to postmodern consciousness. So there's the difference. I'm at the, let's say, I'm reflecting on this relationship between the reflective and immediate consciousness. So that's another level of philosophical inquiry, different from his speculative and dialectical philosophy. I'm doing this quite consciously. I think it's valid to do it like that. But we have to accept that when Hegel says we can't change anything about it, we can't change the way it presents itself, that actually implies that we cannot simply apply it to something else. We can't do this, von dem Auffassen das Begreifen abzuhalten. That's what we need to do. We need to take away the conceptual comprehension, the understanding that is there, because that will be the result of the analysis. So what I did was take the result of the analysis, of what Hegel demonstrated this kind of consciousness actually to be, and I applied it. But in the analysis of sensuous certainty, the first thing we need to do is not to try and conceptualize it immediately. So what can we say on this reflective level about this kind of immediate certainty? It's called, by the way, certainty, because knowledge would imply a whole system of propositions, ideas, categories, statements. Gewissheit is merely the certainty, that is to say, the awareness, the immediately given awareness of the immediately given. Now, what must we say about that? Remember that we said it's Wissen des unmittelbaren oder Seienden. So it's simply a knowledge, some kind of cognitio, some kind of awareness or knowledge in the most general sense in which, for instance, René Descartes uses the word cognitio. It's everything that is in consciousness. So we have to be aufnehmend, receptive to what this consciousness says about itself. By the way, because it says something about itself, it's drawn into this philosophical dialogue. And the question is, didn't it change because of that? Didn't it enter into the realm of philosophical analysis simply by being able to speak? And the answer will be yes. And it has to. Because without it expressing itself in language, it's impossible to examine its truth and its claims. De concrete Inhalt der sinnigen Gewissheit lässt sie unmittelbar als die reichste Erkenntnis, ja als eine Erkenntnis von unendlichem Reichtum erscheinen. Yeah, that's because we can opinionate about everything. That's more in the line of my blog post. But we can point to everything that is somewhere out there. We can point to anything. We can point to lightning. We can point to a tree, to a mountain, to another person. There's no limit. There's no limit in what we can point to. And the only thing that we say about whatever we are pointing to is that it is. Seiendes. Something that is. There is something that is. We're not even taking this category as something, because that is indeed a category, and it has conceptual implications. We're not going to take that as an indication of what we have before us. So, better than something is there, or something is given, we're just saying a given. A given. And I'm pointing toward where it is. So, that is a kind of knowledge, Wissen, simply by making it known, demonstrating by simply pointing towards it. It's Deixis, it's simply demonstrating by pointing at something. Now, in everyday life, this happens a lot, so not so bad an idea that this is also a kind of knowledge. So, presumably, before the era in which language became more developed, this was the way people could indicate something, could communicate with each other by pointing at something. And let's say that you read someone's face and something problematic, and you can point to water, or you can point to food. There's even language behind all of that. Language is implicit. But still, the expression of that kind of knowledge would be simply pointing at something. Es ist die reichste Erkenntnis. There's nothing excluded from, let's say, the pointable, something that is demonstrable by Deixis, by showing, by pointing to something. Vuurwerken, ebensowohl wenn wir in Raum und in der Zeit, als worin er sich ausbreitet, hinaus, als wenn wir uns ein Stück aus dieser Fülle nehmen und durch Teilung in dasselbe hineingehen, keine Grenze zu finden ist. So, I can point to infinity, I can point to the smallest possible thing. Everything is an object, possible object of das Meinen. I can have all sorts of ideas about it, but I'm not going to have that. I can have ideas about that kind of consciousness. Within Hegel's systematic approach, we can't have that. We simply have to accept there is no limit. It's limitless knowledge. It's infinite in the sense that there is no limit to it. The concrete content which sensuous certainty furnishes makes this prima facie appear to be the richest kind of knowledge. So at first glance, prima facie here being the translation of unmittelbar. So immediately when we look at it reflectively, the first thing that we find is, well, okay, no limit. Everything is its object. Everything, but nothing in particular. Everything. which is interesting, because sensuous certainty actually wants to see its object as das diese. Now, das diese goes up, is fulfilled in the pointing towards something. Now, when I point to something, I mean the individual seiende, the individual being that I'm pointing at. I'm not aware of the fact so much that I'm actually applying a category. I'm not taking the diese as a category, because a category would imply some kind of conceptual understanding, and I don't want that. I want to have the immediate as my object, not something that is, let's say, developed or has its origin in a conceptual movement, in a movement of thinking. But that's the first thing to say, that there's no limit to the object that I can point to, and we will find later on that indeed das diese turns out to be universal, and that as a universal it's in contradiction to what it actually does. There is a sort of pragmatic paradox between the statement everything that is true can be pointed at, and the fact that I simply cannot point at that truth itself. Everything that I point at is true. Yeah, but the statement is not something I can point at. So the way I should express or must express the truth of what I'm doing, that is to say, to take the immediate as the truth, is impossible to express without transcending, without leaving, without contradicting precisely the way that I have just defined truth. Sie erscheint außerdem als die wahrhafteste, denn sie hat von dem Gegenstande noch nichts weggelassen. Now, no abstraction here. When I point at something, I mean the whole thing and nothing but the thing, so help me God. That's just what it is. Sondern ihn in seiner ganzen Vollständigkeit vor sich. So there is no fragment out of the abundance it offers of. It's the truest and most authentic knowledge. It has not as yet dropped anything from the object. I'm not making choices about what I find essential and non-essential. It has the object before itself in its entirety and completeness. Now remember that this consciousness has now entered this reflective space. We're asking this consciousness to make us understand what its claim really is. So we're drawing this consciousness into the philosophical arena, so to speak. We're inviting it to enter into a dialogue. Now, and then something happens. Diese Gewissheit aber gibt in der Tat sich selbst für die abstrakteste und ärmste Wahrheit aus. Yeah, that's what this certainty, this consciousness actually does. When asked about the contents of its knowledge, it simply says it is. Doesn't say something is, or doesn't say this is something. It simply says this, implying this is. Now, for itself, that doesn't mean at all that die zinnige Gewissheit, sensuous certainty, knows that it actually has only this abstract knowledge. The act of pointing doesn't refer to itself as something that is poor. Gibt in der Tat sich selbst means that for us as this reflective consciousness, when we try to express the truth of this consciousness, we are left simply with this statement. And for us, then, it's a most abstract and poor truth. And as soon as we get into the level of expression in language, then something else occurs, of course, because we are not simply pointing to something anymore. We're having to say out loud and in words what it actually is, what we are knowing. So this knowledge might just confine itself within itself and say, I'm not going into this, I'm not going to enter into that dialogue, I'm just going to keep myself safe. I'm going to stick to the idea that whatever I see or perceive in some manner, and I can point at that is the truth. It doesn't need to go into this destructive dialogue in which it loses its truth. And that's something very interesting. Hegel assumes, or maybe he simply demonstrates, that because sensuous knowledge actually is driven, unknown to itself, but is driven by this really deep desire to understand, to know, that sensuous consciousness will actually take heart, will take it seriously, that it cannot express itself in the way that it thinks it is. It loses itself in its expression. And it takes that seriously. Diese Gewissheit aber gibt in der Tat sich selbst für die abstrakteste und ärmste Wahrheit aus. Sie sagt, okay, so we got this consciousness talking. Sie sagt von dem. We understand that this pointing, and linguistically then, in language, das diese, this, that is an expression of itself. Oh, wait a minute. Now we have two things. We have the act of knowledge, pointing at something, and we have the act of speaking about it, which implies some kind of reflectiveness. So we have drawn knowledge into this self-examination simply by asking it to express itself. And what does she say then? Sie sagt von dem, was sie weiß, nur dies aus, es ist. Und ihre Wahrheit enthält allein das Sein der Sache. Now, we should understand this very clearly and correctly. Das Sein der Sache here only means that it is. Das Sein der Sache only motivates me to say, es ist, it is. It doesn't mean that the full being of something is contained in its truth. So Sein here corresponds to the category of sign that we find in the science of logic. It's not nothing, it's simply givenness in a way. The givenness of a thing, that's what its truth actually means. Das Bewusstsein seinerseits ist in dieser Gewissheit nur reines Ich. Das Bewusstsein used here not as the name for the whole relationship, but for the subjectivity in it. In this kind of consciousness, subjectivity, consciousness is only there as a pure me, a pure I. I'm a this. Oder ich bin darin nur als reiner Dieser und der Gegenstand ebenso nur als reines Dieses. So that is what Sein actually expresses. Reiner Dieser und reines Dieses. Sein does express, therefore, a relationship, actually. I hope I get the English word correct here, by dissimilating it. Sein only wants to express the being of the object. But as expressing the being of the object, it implies a being of itself as subject. So Sein can never be understood as referring only to some kind of objectivity. As soon as I express something as scientist, there is also another scientist. There are two scientists immediately, Sciende immediately, and that's Ich, this here, over against that there. Ich bin darum nur als reiner Dieser und der Gegenstand ebenso nur als reines Dieses. Ich, dieser, bin dieser Sache nicht darum gewiss, weil ich als Bewusstsein hierbei mich entwickelte und mannigfaltig den Gedanken bewegte. This particular conscious I, am certain of this fact before me, not because I, qua consciousness, have developed myself in connection with it and in manifold ways set thought to work about it, not again because the fact, the thing of which I am certain in virtue of its having a multitude of distinct qualities, was replete with possible modes of relation and a variety of connections with other things. All of that is abstracted from when I use the word Sein or Seiendes for the object that has being, and Sein for the being of that object. I'm certain of it, I have a knowledge of it, which I can only express properly by pointing to it. There is no inner development on the side of the object. Knowledge of the object doesn't seem to be a result of anything. I'm not examining something. Perception is not a movement. We are talking about the result of all of that, which dissimulates any process that went into it to produce that particular thought or relationship. So nothing actually happens here. Let's jump a little bit and come to this. Ebenso ist die Gewissheit als Beziehung, so when we talk about consciousness as a whole, as a relationship, als Beziehung, unmittelbare reine Beziehung. Rein meaning here pure, unadulterated, without any mixture with thought and categories, without any kind of movement. No, it's simply there. Reine Beziehung. Reiner dieser, that's me. Reines dieses, that's that object. And reine Beziehung, between the two. So you can say, der Einzelne weiß reines dieses oder das Einzelne. The individual here knows the individual thing over there, and there is nothing going on further, so it's the most truthful and the most limitless knowledge that I can have. Nothing is left out, and there's no limit to that knowledge, and that's how it works. Now, this is the reason that I started talking about postmodern consciousness, because it has so much in common with this idea that truth is simply mine. Truth is simply the way I take things, even if I can only point to it, because there's no argument possible for my opinions. Why do I think this or that? Well, because I think this or that. Ultimately, that's what it boils down to. I might have a whole story about my arguments, my so-called arguments, but it's not the logic that actually drove me to the acceptance of a certain opinion. It's merely the pleasantness of the opinion, how it works out in my psychological state. That's the reason I have this kind of opinion. Most opinions are without ground, without argument, even in their expression. Sometimes in the struggle between opinions, people might come up with so-called arguments, but they're merely props to underscore, to help me express that opinion as simply something that I hold. I hold this opinion, and that's ultimately what it boils down to. Me as this individual, Einzelner, don't touch me, I'm Einzelner, and don't belong to any kind of class or group of people. I'm simply this individual with a sort of absolute approach to the world. I know something, this is what I know, and this is what I say. Now this die zinnige Gewissheit is even less presumptuous than postmodern consciousness in as far as it acknowledges the abstract nature of its own knowledge simply by knowing that the only way it can express itself is by saying es ist. And I'm presuming that in postmodern consciousness actually what is happening, not that someone says es ist, it is, but that he says it's so and so. Basically, I believe it has the same structure, it has the same method of legitimizing itself, defending itself. However, of course, this is not the same as sensuous certainty or sinnliche Gewissheit. There's something way deeper going on in Hegel. But I believe that the structures that Hegel developed here are actually also developing, or have developed over time, in our culture. And that all kinds of shades and grades of sensuous certainty are apparent within our culture. And that's the reason for the blog post, but now we're studying Hegel itself, so I need to make distinction between the two. Okay, so far so good. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you next time.